Hey there, welcome to this episode of Speaking of. Today I'm speaking of a pretty significant piece of legislation that is being considered right now by the Oregon Senate. Um, this is House Bill 2002. It originated in the House back in February, I think, is when it had its first reading, and then it went through a number of revisions in committee, and a number of amendments were made to it. And on May 1st, it was finally passed by the House, and I say finally because this is legislation that was put forward and proposed by the Democrat Party here in Oregon, and the Republican Party tried very hard to prevent this bill from making it out of the House. They proposed a number of delays, and they tried to get it referred back to committee a number of different times. They tried to postpone a vote until after the legislature adjourns for the season. And so they made a number of efforts to try to stall passage of this bill because of the concerns that they have with the legislation. Currently, this bill is waiting in the Senate, and so it did eventually make it out of the House on May 1st, so a little over a week ago. And then it is expected to have a reading, I think, tomorrow and then again on Friday. And so, depending on what happens there, is when whether it will make it to be signed into law. But the hang-up right now is that a number of Republican representatives and senators have walked out of the Senate, or walked out of the legislature, and so that means that they are not around to. There's not enough people currently to cast a vote on any piece of legislation, and that means that everything is kind of in limbo. And this piece of legislation is one of the bills that was given as reason for these. There's, I think, six of them, maybe not six of them, I think, and they're in the eighth day of this walkout. And this piece of legislation is one of the reasons, is one of the bills that they are concerned about. They're giving different reasons. They're not going to come out and say it's this bill or that bill, but they're giving reasons essentially as to why they're not participating. But that's beyond the scope of what we can do right now. The bill that we're looking at, House Bill 2002, is known as it covers a broad range of it covers a lot of different topics, but essentially it's known as the bill that modifies access to abortion and to gender reassignment care, gender affirming treatment as it's sometimes called. And so it has a lot of provisions that relate to these two very significant areas. If you read through the legislation, a lot of it is pretty technical stuff. It's a lot of legalese, but the summary, I can quote the summary. The summary states that this bill would modify provisions related to reproductive health rights, access to reproductive health care, and gender affirming treatment. And so those really essentially, it has to do with abortion and gender reassignment care, gender affirming treatment. So I want to kind of unpack a little bit of this. I want to try to lay out for you what I think what the bill actually says, what it would require, and then I want to analyze it a little bit and then offer something of a critique. And I'll do that in two parts. I'll look first at the provisions that are related to abortion, and then second, I'll look at the provisions that are related to gender affirming treatment. When it comes to abortion, essentially the goal of this bill is to expand access to abortion care, or reproductive rights care, and reproductive health care information. So the bill kind of breaks it down, and essentially it makes a distinction between health care information, reproductive health care information, and reproductive health care services. And so essentially reproductive health care information would be access to information about, say, birth control or contraceptives, abortion access and so on. That's information. So it governs who a healthcare provider, a doctor, a nurse practitioner, a pharmacist, etc., who may they inform and give information about this sort of these sorts of things. And then the services, the healthcare services, are actually providing the medical procedure. So it would be either an abortion or some other actual service that would be provided. And so it's expanding access to these two things. Now, the distinction is important because the law specifies the law is a little bit more restrictive when it comes to reproductive health services as opposed to reproductive health information. So the law specifies, the legislation proposed suggests would allow for a minor of any age to give consent to receive healthcare information without a parent or guardian's consent. So, in other words, anyone who is a minor of any age may receive information on reproductive health care, reproductive, contraceptives, and so on, and the parent of that child would not need to be informed. So, its information would be available to minors of any age. A minor who is 15 years or older may, under this proposed law, would be able to give consent for hospital care, medical, surgical diagnosis, or treatment. And so and it's actually interesting because the law, as it's written, it seems to say this applies to all kinds of medical treatment and all kinds of medical care, not just reproductive care. Even though the legislation is crafted as reproductive care, the law seems to expand access to all kinds of medical care and medical treatment for a minor 15 years and older without parental consent. And so what that means is that a child who's 15, 16 years old can go and seek medical treatment and medical care for themselves, and the parent would never have to be told. The doctor, the nurse practitioner, the pharmacist, etc., would never need to inform the parents or would not need to gain consent from the parents to perform that treatment, unless the minor authorizes the medical provider to give that information to the parents. So it essentially puts the control, the decision making of medical care and disclosure of medical information into the hands of a minor who's 15 years and older. Now, again, I want to just so we're clear, those under 15 wouldn't. This doesn't speak to that situation. A 13-year-old could not get medical care or treatment apart from parental consent. This part of the law, this provision of law, applies only to those who are 15 and older. But think of this. Think of what this actually means in practice. This means that a 15-year-old girl who is pregnant can get birth control or can get an abortion, can get medical treatment without a parent ever finding out about this. Now, an abortion, even if for a moment we grant that an abortion is permissible, let's just say for the sake of argument, even if we grant that this is something that is a valid option for somebody, even with that in place, this law would allow for a really significant medical procedure without the parent ever finding out. You're talking about a procedure that has significant, it has physical risk, it has the risk of long-term mental and physical health, all kinds of related things, and this could all be done without the parent of that child ever finding out. And that's what I find. And now, to be clear, I think abortion is morally is wrong. I think it's a violation of the Sixth Commandment against the prohibition against killing and taking the life of another person. And so that, but to me, those are two separate though related issues. You've got the fact that now a 15-year-old can gain an abortion for herself. And you've got the fact that this can all be done without the consent of a parent. The assumption here, and I think this is sort of if you dig beneath the surface here, I think the assumption behind legislation like this is that ultimately parents cannot be trusted to know what is best for their children, and so it's better to minimize or even remove parental involvement for the well-being of their children. The assumption is that a child will be better served if their parents have less authority over them. Now, I grant that there are very, very, very small number of cases where probably the parent is parental knowledge would be actually a worse thing. That would be in cases of, say, rape or incest, usually in the cases of incest. But that is such a proportionately small number of cases, number one. And number two, the language of this legislation easily could have been crafted to preclude that. And so what this really is an attempt to do is it's an attempt to give more autonomy and authority to children, assuming that children are going to know what is best. My critique of that is that I think family is and always has been such a vital building block of society, and I think this legislation undermines that. It removes the authority, and it removes the power of the parent from the life of the child. And I think that's destabilizing not just to a family, but ultimately to a culture. It's sort of rooted in this idea that the state knows best for children and for families, and therefore we have to trust the state when the state says remove the parental authority. And that is alarming to me. This is legislation that I am gravely concerned about, and I think it's even from a non-faith perspective, I think there's reason for great concern here. Now, as to the second provision of the bill, the second aspect of this bill has to do with gender-affirming care. Now, if you read through the bill as it's written and as it's been amended, there's a lot of provisions that have to do with it really focuses on ensuring that doctors, nurses, medical providers, pharmacists, nurse practitioners, and so on will never be disciplined for providing what they call gender-affirming care. And so the legislation itself really focuses on sort of the legalese. It makes sure that gender-affirming care is required to be covered by insurance companies. And this part is under some debate, but they also make the case. They also, depending on who you talk to, the law would also cover detransitioning, changing back. But there's some debate around whether that's actually clear in the law. But the point is, and the goal is to expand access to gender-affirming care to make sure that doctors, nurses, and other healthcare providers will provide gender-affirming care, and that's all spelled out exactly what that is in the law. That's all going to be provided, and people will be able to access that in Oregon. And of course, this is really just another step. It's really just another part of the movement towards redefining gender. It's part of this whole movement towards allowing ourselves to be in control of who we want to be and self-defining everything down to our biological characteristics. And that's one of the assumptions that's built in this, that's sort of baked into this legislation. That's that gender is not a biological phenomenon. It's really a self-determined phenomenon. You might be born with biological anatomy, but your actual gender has nothing to do with your chromosomes or your anatomy. Your gender is really self-determined. So Sharon James is a researcher, and she quotes, I forget the name of the guy that she quotes, but she quotes one of the sort of the pioneers of this theory, and they say that when they're talking about gender, it says gender is a person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond with the sex assigned at birth. So you hear in that gender is the whole idea of gender is no longer tied to physical and biological realities, but gender in our culture, gender has moved away from that. Gender is now self-determined. It's really just what you feel as an individual, and what you feel in terms of being masculine or being feminine, that may correspond with your anatomy, but it might not, and it doesn't really matter. Another example is from the genderbread person, and this was an activist by the name, I think his name is Scott Killerman. I might be getting the name wrong, but anyways, he put together this genderbread, which is kind of this visual depiction of how to think about gender and sex and gender presentation and so on. And he defines gender this way. He says gender is who you are, who you in your head know yourself to be based on how much you align or don't align with what you understand to be the options for gender. Like, I don't know how many more times you could squeeze the word you into a sentence like that, but again, it's just this complete relocation of self, of our identity to self-governance. We are autonomous, and so we've moved away culturally. We've moved away from gender having anything to do with biology or anatomy to complete just you get to decide. It's whatever you feel like. It's completely subjective. And I think related to that is a theme or a trend in our culture which really says you cannot be happy unless you seek and find your own identity. You've got to find your own expression of who you are, and that's what will make you happy. And so we live in this kind of create your own identity world, and it's like happiness is always just out of reach. It's right there for people who want it. You just have to sort of find who you are and express it and be true to who you feel to be. Now, my critique of this is there's a couple of things. The first is that this, for all the talk that we have about being, believing in science, and this is particularly true on left-leaning politics, for all the talk about trusting the science, this whole approach completely denies and it completely throws out science and basic biology. Even the American College of Pediatrics actually comes out with a statement, and American College of Pediatrics is rooted in science, and they urge, this is a quote from them, it says, we urge legislatures and educators to reject all policies that condition children to accept as normal a life of chemical and surgical impersonation of the opposite sex. So here you get a group of rational, science-based thinking that is essentially coming out and saying this approach of letting children, especially at a very young age, decide their own gender and then express that however they want, this approach is contrary to science and it's damaging to children. And furthermore, kind of on that same theme, there are no long-term studies that can actually establish any long-term effects of gender transitioning. And so with this whole movement towards letting people create and define their own identity, their own gender, and make their own gender for themselves, and if they feel their biology doesn't match their perceived sense of gender, they can just change their biology. And there's this push to do this, and it's an escalating push. There's no long-term studies that actually support that or really try to that can establish that this is a good thing. In fact, there are some studies to show, even in countries like Sweden, where this has been around for a little while, there are some studies to show that the suicide rates are higher for those who transition rather than for those who, even if they experience what we sometimes call gender dysphoria, there's good evidence to suggest that 98% of people who experience that in their young age sort of revert back to a normal, healthy psychological mindset after puberty. And so this push to change gender before a kid even hits puberty is actually, it's shocking how little evidence there really is for that. Biblically speaking, gender, it is tied to our biology, and by God's design, I believe gender includes the ability to for men and women to be co-creators of life, to come together and to create life. And I think femininity in particular carries the ability to nurture and to sustain and to create life. And so it's bizarre to me when you have a biological male who then decides to present as a female, but is incapable then of creating and producing life. I think that's contrary, and you know. So I think there's a real denial of science here, and I think instead this is just rooted in a cultural agenda. It's rooted in a cultural movement. It's sort of this cultural mindset that I think is woven very deeply into the fabric of our culture that says you will only be happy if you pursue who you feel like you are. And in doing so, it's usurping the authority of the family. It's really encouraging children, you be who you want to be. You don't need to worry about what mom and dad are telling you. But increasingly, this is showing up in schools, in literature, and that's concerning. I think it's a flaw. So here's the other part of that. Gender gender has a social biological component. So in other words, you've got your sex, your anatomical part of who you are, but your sense of what does it mean to be male or female is sort of created over time, and that means that so it can be fed. It can be, you can kind of push people in one direction or the other. That means it's possible to sort of send a message that, look, if you want to be a boy, if it's a biological female, you want to be a boy, you can be a boy. Who do you feel like being today? What gender do you feel like being? And you can sort of impress that message onto a kid from a very young age, and they'll begin to believe it, and then they'll begin to adopt that over time. And so what we end up doing when we end up telling kids, look, you can be whoever you want, we end up feeding this mindset. We end up actually pushing them in a direction rather than just letting them choose for themselves. We think we're being neutral, but in fact we're not. We're actually pushing them in a certain direction. We're shaping their identity, and then they end up believing that, okay, they're telling me that even if I'm biologically a male, I can be a female if I want, and I am female, and you can sort of nudge them in that direction, leading them then to take permanent steps that are life altering. So what do we do in all of this? What is a Christian response? I think there's a couple things. Number one, I think the Bible calls us to love those who experience gender dysphoria. I think what we need to see is that behind this is a real hunger and a longing and a search for purpose and for meaning and fulfillment in life. Many people who experience this, what they're told is this gap between their biological gender or biological sex and their gender. Many people who experience that are told that they will really be happy if you just change your gender, then you'll be happy, then you'll be fulfilled. And in the end, it doesn't work out that way. There's a lot of loneliness, there's a lot of sadness beneath all of this. And in that aspect, for Christians, our response ought to be compassion. It ought to be a posture of humility and gentleness and love towards those who are experiencing this. In one sense, are people that just sort of, they've been raised in this culture, and this is what they've been taught to think, and so they've just kind of imbibed it. And that doesn't mean, we're not saying then that they're victims. We're just acknowledging that they are a product of our culture, and they are people then that need to experience the love and the compassion of the Christian community. And I think we can do that even as we hold to our convictions, even as we hold to our beliefs about what gender is, what the Bible says about gender, and God's design for male and female. And I think it's going to take great courage to speak up against this, especially I think in the public arena. I think we ought to speak loudly and clearly, especially against legislation like this, or at least we ought to be a voice against this, because this is shaping our culture, and it will continue to shape our culture, and we need to have courage and conviction to speak against it. I think one of the tragic things in all of this is the way that language has been distorted, so that if you oppose something like this, even if you're the kindest and most compassionate person to those who are experiencing this and living with this, if you speak up and oppose the idea and the concept and critique the idea, you can be labeled, transphobic or hateful. And that's a terrible misuse of language, in the sense that if you're called hateful for such things, that's a terrible misuse of language, and it's a tactic that is used to undermine a differing position, and we ought to resist that, and we ought not to give in to that. We ought to still hold to the courage of our convictions. We can love people, and we ought to love people that we disagree with, even as we have different convictions from them. So The legislation, it's being read tomorrow again in the Senate, and scheduled at least for tomorrow, and then it's scheduled again for Friday. And if it's passed, then it goes to the governor's desk. She's got 5 days to sign it or not. So it's a major change, and it will reflect a major change in our culture. It's one that, as Christians, we find ourselves, I think, at odds with much of what it says. Hey, thanks for joining me today. This has been an episode of Speaking Of, and we will see you next time.